The bright yellow rays of the sun were just barely peeking over the tall pines of the forest when Jason woke up the next morning. The sunlight fell in through the spider-webbed glass of the windshield and landed across his face. He moaned and twisted uncomfortably in his seat. The accident last night left his back and neck feeling stiff. The night sleeping in the car didn't help it any better. He might even have whiplash, he thought, as he ran his hand over the back of his neck. But that would have to wait. This was a new day. The sun was up, the blizzard was over, and they needed to get moving. Jason reached across the seat and rocked Maria awake. "Up and at 'em," he said. Maria's face scrunched as she awoke. Her back arched and arms reached out the best they could when she stretched. "What time is it?" she groaned, still not fully awake. "Just after 9. Jason held his phone up and read the digital screen. It's a wonder this thing still had any power left, then turned it off to conserve it. Good thing he charged it before they went on this trip. He reached his arm around to the back seat, even as every muscle in his body screamed at him not to, and placed it on Sean's shoulder. "Come on, dude. Time to get up." Sean raised an arm and batted him away. "No, Mommy, I don't want to go to school." He shifted around in the back seat and fell asleep again. Jason snorted and grabbed Sean more roughly. "Wake up already!" He pulled Sean hard enough to make him roll off the seat and onto the floor. With a loud thud, Sean landed and jolted up, now wide awake. "Huh? What? Where am I?" He looked around hurriedly, catching sight of Maria and Jason in the front of the car. "Oh yeah," he said, resting his arms over his knees and placing one hand on his forehead. He let out a long sigh. "Come on, we need to get going." Jason forced the driver's door open, pushing a great deal of snow out of the way when he did. "And where are we going?" Maria asked as she followed him out. Jason stood up. The snow reached to the middle of his shins on each leg. "If we can get back to the road, we can follow that into town. Then we can call somebody, or get a motel or something." He pointed up the hill behind the car. The blizzard had been so harsh last night that the snow completely covered the tracks left by the tires. Even so, Jason thought he could make out the depressions in the snow of where they had been. Sean climbed out of the car and stood next to his friends. "I hope so. I'm starving. I don't suppose we have any food at all." "I'm afraid not," Jason said. He opened the trunk and pulled out his red duffel bag along with the mag light. He tucked it away in the duffel bag before zipping it back up. "Come on," he said as he slammed the trunk closed and turned to walk up the embankment. "It's at least 12 miles to town, so we need to get a move on." The idling engine of a snowmobile sputtered behind Uncle Rob as he stood ankle deep in the snow. He took a long drag from his cigarette. Before him, his nephew's blue sedan lay half buried in the snow. The hood was propped open, bent in half, the grate caved in, and the windshield smashed. A trail of footprints led away from the broken car and disappeared into the woods. With a flick, he tossed the cigarette away. It landed in the snow, fizzled, and died. He readjusted the sling of his hunting rifle over his shoulder and stepped back onto the snowmobile. It lurched forward as he hit the gas and sped off into the woods, following the trail of footprints. That idiot nephew of his, Jason, and his useless illegal girlfriend had done this to themselves. He thought to himself that she didn't like hearing the truth about how she was a job-stealing wet-back spick, and made Jason drive out into the blizzard last night like a bunch of fools, and it looked like they got themselves in a real clusterfuck now. But Robert knew that if that kid didn't get home by tonight, there would be hell to pay from his sister, Jason's mother. So now he had to bail the kid out of trouble, again. A branch suddenly snapped from a tree overhead and plummeted to the ground. It crashed directly in front of him in a burst of fine powdered snow. He twisted the handlebar hard to the left and skidded to a stop, kicking up a spray. "Shit," he said. With a twist of the key, he shut off the engine and paused for a moment to catch his breath. To calm his nerves, he pulled another cigarette from the pack. He clicked open his lighter and was about to ignite the smoke, but stopped. Sitting on the snowmobile, with an unlit cigarette in his mouth, lighter in his hand, and rifle slung over his back, Robert paused and looked around. The woods had fallen eerily silent. No wind rustled the trees. No small animals scurried across the ground. Aside from him, nothing moved. His eyes fell upon the tree branch laying in the snow. All the needles were a dark green, and the bark was strong and healthy. He peered at the base just to make sure his suspicion was correct. It was. The branch didn't just fall at random. It had been torn from the tree and thrown down at him violently. With his free hand, he started to slide the sling off his shoulder. Uncle Rob took his gun in hand, fished a few bullets out of his vest pocket, and loaded it. Then, with the same deliberate movements, tilted his head back and peered up into the canopy. The cigarette fell from his mouth. A large, clawed hand reached down from above and latched itself around his face. The creature lifted him effortlessly off the snowmobile. Robert kicked and tried to scream, but only muffles escaped the monster's grip. His gun and lighter fell back into the snow as he was pulled up into the pine boughs. His terrified screams stopped when his neck snapped and the woods became silent again. The duffel bag's straps dug into Jason's shoulder the more he walked. The sun was already beginning to fall back below the line of trees, casting their dark shadows over the earth. He gasped for breath, the wispy vapor of air streaming from his lips and dissipating right before him. His shoes and socks were soaked through from the snow. His feet and legs so numb from the cold he feared he might be getting frostbite. They'd been walking all day and still couldn't find the road. How hard was this? They hadn't even gone very far down the hill before they crashed. Why couldn't they find the stinking road already? Maria wrapped her arms tightly around herself. She shivered in the knee-deep snow. "Jason," she called, "it's getting dark. What are we going to do?" Wiping the freezing sweat from his forehead, Jason placed his hands on his knees and took several deep breaths. "I think," he finally said after several seconds, "we may have to try making camp for the night." "Making camp?" Sean repeated. "Out here?" He threw his arms in the air. "We'll freeze to death if we spend another night in the woods like this." He pointed accusingly at Maria. "You should have just sucked it up instead of throwing a fit yesterday." "Sucked it up? Are you serious?" Maria glared angrily at him. "You expected me to just take his racist remarks lying down?" Jason held up his hands and addressed both of them. "Guys, let's just calm." "It would be better than being stuck out here freezing to death," Sean shouted, kicking at the snow. "If you just dealt with it, we'd be sitting around a nice warm fire right now with a hot cup of coffee or hot chocolate. But no. You had to throw a fit and make us drive off in the night during a blizzard, all because some old guy called you names." Maria was aghast. "So now it's my fault. You're blaming me for this." Jason started. "No, that's not—" "Yeah!" Sean spat. "It's your fault." He then turned around and faced Jason. "And your fault because you didn't want to hit some stupid deer." He stormed off, walking into the woods. "Wait a minute, Sean! Come back here!" Jason shouted after him. Sean didn't turn around or even acknowledge he'd heard him. Instead, just kept walking deeper into the trees. As the shadows grew longer, Sean disappeared completely from view. "Aw, hell!" Jason cursed. He resettled the duffel bag over his back and started off after his friend. "Where are you going?" Maria asked, still shivering. "I'm going to find him. The last thing we need to do is split up while we're out here," Jason replied. "Just let him go. We'll be better off without him," Maria said. "You're just mad. Plus, we're all just hungry. We need to be calm and collected until we get back to town. Then you two can bicker all you want," Jason retorted. Just then, a blood-curdling scream cried out from the woods, followed by a tearing sound like the ripping of flesh. It was Sean's voice. "No! God, please! God help me! Help me!" His screaming was cut short by a loud, sickening snap, a sound that reminded Jason of a leg being torn, being ripped from a turkey at Thanksgiving. The woods fell silent. No birds, no crickets, no chipmunks, nothing. Then a cry, this new one, like a dying elk, split the air. Jason and Maria stood frozen in their tracks. Neither moved, nor dared to blink or breathe. Jason felt the blood run cold in his veins. His fingers gripped tightly around the strap of his duffel bag, his knuckles white with fear. A new sound came from the trees, the ripping of flesh and chewing of a large carnivorous animal. Staring into the shadows between the trees, Jason noticed the movement of something that resembled antlers. "We need to get out of here, now," Jason whispered in Maria's ear, his voice low and hushed, the words coming fast. He grabbed Maria by the arm and started running. His legs tore a deep path through the snow, leaving an obvious trail behind him. He hardly cared. All he wanted was to put as much distance between himself and that thing in the woods as he could. White vapors of air whisked from his nose and mouth as he ran. Cold sweat dripped down his forehead. "Jason!" Maria shouted. "Jason, what was that thing? It just killed Sean, didn't it? Was that a bear?" "No, I don't think so," Jason shouted over his shoulder. He pulled her along, trying not to stop or slow down, even for a second. "Remember that thing that ran in front of the car last night? The deer thing?" "Of course I remember. You think it was that?" "Yes. I saw antlers moving in the trees." They ran until their legs were sore. The sun had nearly set, with only the faint orange tint left in the western sky swiftly disappearing behind the mountains. Jason propped himself up against a tree. His heart hammered in his chest. White puffs of air formed around his face with each breath. Maria was equally tired. "Jason," she said between gasps, "you never answered me fully. What do you think that was?" "I think—" Jason paused for breath. "I don't know. All I know for sure is that something killed Sean, and I don't want it to kill us." Maria noticed something off in the distance. It looked almost like a rock sitting on the snow, but also unnatural. "Do you still have your flashlight?" "Yeah." He pulled it from the duffel bag. "I think I see something over there." She pointed off in the woods. Jason clicked the flashlight on. A bright beam of light flooded out and landed on the object. "That's my uncle's snowmobile," Jason said. They slowly walked towards it. "He must have been out looking for us." "But why would he leave it here?" "Maybe it ran out of gas?" Maria suggested. "No, look." Jason motioned with the flashlight to the large red metal tank strapped to the vehicle's back. "He has a spare tank. Never goes anywhere without it. He's paranoid like that." He scanned his light around the snowmobile, finding his uncle's lighter and hunting rifle. "And these," he said, picking up the lighter. "My uncle would never leave these laying around. Plus, there are no footprints leading away from here." He slipped the lighter casually into his pocket. "What the hell is going on?" As if in response, something fell from the tree above him and landed with a splat right next to Jason. He turned the light on it. A pool of blood was forming in the snow, turning it red. Jason tilted the flashlight up into the branches over him and shifted his eyes up. What he saw made him revolt in terror and disgust. The corpse of Uncle Rob hung from the branches overhead. His head was twisted all the way around and hung limply from its neck, barely held in place by the few strips of muscle and skin. His torso had been torn open, ribs protruding from his chest. Sections of flesh had been ripped, chewed, leaving only the white bone underneath. Blood ran down his arms and dripped from his fingertips. Maria placed her hand over her mouth and heaved, barely managing to keep herself from vomiting. Jason was not so lucky. He dropped the flashlight, placed his hands over his knees, and puked up everything he had in his stomach. Even with his stomach voided, he continued to heave and gasp. What the fuck was going on? What the ever-loving fuck was doing this? He wiped his mouth with his sleeve, spitting as much bile from his mouth as he could. Jason grabbed the flashlight and scanned it over the snowmobile again. "The keys are still here," he said. "We can use it to get back to the cabin." "Why not just go the rest of the way into town?" Maria asked. "It's too dark to try doing that tonight. If we can make it back to the cabin, we will at least be safe from whatever that thing is. And then try to make it down in the morning when we have light," Jason explained. "Do you think that thing that killed Sean also killed your uncle?" Maria asked. He shined the light back up into the trees at his uncle's corpse, then turned away grimly. "I don't know of anything that would do that to a person. Come on, let's just get this thing started and—" A loud scream echoed from the forest, a desperate cry like the sound of a dying man. Jason and Maria felt their blood run cold from just the sound of it. Jason grabbed his uncle's rifle and quickly jumped on the back of the snowmobile. "Hurry up! Get on!" Maria climbed on behind him and laced her arms around his waist. He twisted the key and the engine rumbled to life. The headlight cut through the blackness. He gunned it. A spray of powder kicked up behind him as he did. Jason followed the trail his uncle had left in the snow earlier that day and was able to quickly find the road. He followed it all the way back to the cabin, Maria clinging tightly to him the whole way. Once back, they started the generator and went inside, locking the door securely behind them. With the doors locked and windows fastened shut, Jason and Maria collapsed on the couch with exhaustion. It was only now, after reaching safety, that Jason began to react. He leaned forward, his elbows rested on his knees, and he stared at the floor. His best friend was dead. His uncle was dead. These two simple facts hit him like a ton of bricks, and he started to cry. Why had all this happened? He just wanted to introduce his girlfriend to Uncle Rob. Why did it turn out like this? Maria slid over to him, her arm draped over his shoulder. She couldn't think of any words to lessen the pain, only able to offer her sympathy. Still, her heart ached for him. "I'm sorry," was all she could say. "I know. I'm sorry, too. If I hadn't talked you into coming out here, none of this would have happened," Jason said, using his sleeve to wipe his eyes. Maria held him close. Even if there was a bit of truth to that, there was no point in it. "Well, let's look on the bright side. We're safe now. We have a way of getting home, and whatever was hunting us is gone now." Jason nodded. "Yeah, you're right." He stood up from the couch, Maria's hand in his. "Come on, let's see what kind of food my uncle has stored around here." Maria smiled. "That sounds like a good idea." The drone of the generator suddenly stopped, and the lights shut off. The room was now completely dark, aside from the rectangles of silver light from the moon which fell in from the windows. Maria and Jason froze in place, terrified. "Jason, do you think it's that thing again?" "I don't know." Jason handed her the flashlight. "Take this. We need to go out and check the generator." He picked up the hunting rifle, making sure it was loaded. "You want us both to go out there?" Maria's voice shook as she spoke. "We'll be safer if we stay together. Besides, I can't carry a flashlight and a gun at the same time." He stepped over to the door and started undoing the locks. "Shine the light directly at the door when I open it, okay?" Maria nodded. "Good." He grabbed the knob, twisted, and shoved the door open. The gun was raised, barrel pointed out into the night, but there was nothing there. He lowered it with hesitation. "Come on, then." Together, side by side, they stepped out into the cold, dark night. The beam from the flashlight illuminated their way. They found the cord for the generator and followed it, the snow crunching under their feet. The cord wove its way through the snow along the side of the cabin until it stopped suddenly. The end frayed. Jason knelt down and picked it up, holding the broken cord in the light. "Jason," Maria said. The flashlight shook in her hands. "What is going on?" A new sound reached their ears. A raspy, snarling sound. The huffing and panting of a large animal breathing. It was unmistakable and very close by. Maria felt the hot bursts of air on the nape of her neck. Her heart raced. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly she turned around. The beam of light fell on the ground directly behind her and illuminated a pair of cloven hooves. Raising the flashlight up little by little, Maria saw the creature's muscular legs covered in fur, then its emaciated torso, the skin pulled so taut over the flesh that pulsating organs and the rib cage were visible. Lastly, the light fell on the creature's head. It had a deer-like face, but the appearance of a rabid deer. The eyes were shining red and sunken into their sockets. The animal had no lips, having chewed them off long ago, leaving only the bleeding, maggot-covered base of the gums. A set of antlers reached out from its head and clawed at the sky. Maria's blood ran cold in her veins. She wanted to scream, but her voice was caught. Cold sweat rolled down her face. Her hands trembled. She wanted to run, faint, anything, but her eyes could not be drawn away from the monstrosity that stood before her. She couldn't even hear Jason screaming at her. "Maria!" he shouted, holding up the gun. "Get out of the way! Move!" She didn't move. She was too terrified to do anything. The deer creature simply stared down at her from its 8.5-foot height. It snorted with each breath, and little puffs of vapor rose from its teeth. Finally it opened its mouth and screamed, a loud, ear-splitting shrill. Its rancid breath, like a carcass rotting in the sun, filled Maria's nostrils and made her gag. She covered her mouth and turned away, coughing. Now with a clear shot, Jason fired the rifle. The bullet struck the creature in the chest, making it recoil and cry out in pain. It looked down at the hole in its chest, now oozing black fluid. The creature turned back to Jason and snarled. Jason quickly reloaded the gun and prepared to fire another shot, but the monster was already charging for him. It reached out with its long clawed arms and grabbed Jason by the shoulders, knocking the gun from his hands. "Let go of me, you ugly son of a bitch!" Jason shouted. He kicked, but the creature held firm. It lifted him over its head, opened its mouth wider than seemed possible, and prepared to take a bite. Maria took a shovel leaning by the side of the cabin and swung it with all her strength. It hit the monster on the back. The metal end snapped off and flew away. All it seemed to do was make the creature angry. It twisted its head around violently, almost like snapping its own neck, and glared at Maria. The creature flung Jason away into the darkness. With renewed interest it approached the girl. Maria held the broken pole in her hands like a spear. She trembled and her teeth chattered, but she was too afraid to run. With a single swipe of its massive arm, it struck Maria across the face and sent her crashing to the ground, landing face first in the snow. Even as she tried to get up, the beast was upon her. It pinned her to the ground and sunk its teeth into her right shoulder. She screamed in agony as her flesh was ripped away. Tears ran down her face, mixing with the blood and the snow beneath her. The creature threw back its head and swallowed in a single gulp. As it was going back for more, Jason ran up to it. He was shouting and swinging something with both hands. He brought it down on the creature's head, punctured it on the antlers. It was the spare gas tank from the snowmobile. Gasoline gushed out from the newly formed holes, covering the monster's head and body. It screamed. The gas stung its eyes, and it clawed at its face, trying to get the tank off its head. Jason grabbed Maria while the creature was distracted. "Can you run?" She screamed in response. Blood seeped from the gaping hole above her arm. Jason noticed, but couldn't do anything about it now. "Don't worry, I have an idea." He grabbed the flashlight and started waving it around. "Hey, you mutated freak show! Come and get me!" The creature charged him, running on all fours with its claws and hooves digging into the ground. Jason reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his uncle's lighter. He clicked it 3 times, and on the 3rd try, a tiny yellow flame emerged. Just as he pulled his arms back to throw it, the creature crashed into him. The sharp antlers pierced through his chest, impaling him and sticking out through his back. Jason gasped, Blood filled his lungs, and his whole body jolted as he was lifted into the air on the creature's horns. All his strength flowed away, his grip relaxed, and the lighter fell from his hands, landing on the creature's gas-covered fur. Instantly the gas ignited, spreading over the creature in waves of orange and yellow. It yelled in agony. Its skin and flesh melted in the heat. It flung its head from side to side, dislodging Jason from its horns. It thrashed about wildly, trying to extinguish the flames. It lunged at the cabin, crashing through a window. Inside, the flames spread to the curtains, the rugs, everything, until the entire cabin was ablaze. The creature's screams still echoed from inside until finally they died out and were swallowed by the roaring fire. Jason crumbled in the snow. Blood flowed out from the holes in his chest and turned it red. Maria ran to him. "Jason!" she screamed. She knelt in the snow next to him, placing her hands on his back. His skin was already growing cold. "Jason, are you all right? Say something!" His breathing was weak. He barely managed to open one eye and look up at her. She was crying, weeping over him. Using the last of his strength, he placed his hand on her cheek and wiped the tears away, just before his eyelids became too heavy and closed, never to open again. Maria crouched on the ground, her left hand clutched over her injured shoulder, and she sobbed. Her friend was dead, her boyfriend was dead, even Uncle Rob was dead. She was now alone in the woods, her only source of shelter burning away, a horrible injury to her shoulder which throbbed in pain, and no food. She brought her legs up to her chest, wrapped her arms around them, and stared blankly at the fire as it burned the cabin to the ground. She looked out the corner of her eye at Jason's body, and her stomach growled. 3 weeks later. An SUV belonging to the Forest Service came to a stop in the driveway of what used to be Robert's cabin. A man and a woman stepped out, surveying the damage. "Well, Jim," the woman said, "what do you make of it?" "Oh, Melissa, I think it was probably started by a kerosene lamp, or maybe the fireplace wasn't properly shut off. We'll learn more about it when we get the official team up here to investigate. We're lucky it didn't spread to anything else," Jim said. "The blizzard that came through was likely the indirect cause of the fire." "How do you mean?" "Well, stranded up here for days on end. It's likely they tried to build fires to keep warm, and one day just didn't take all the right precautions," Jim explained. "Yeah, and the reason it took us so long to get up here. What with all the roads all blocked off with snow." "No kidding." A billowing cry echoed from the trees. Jim and Melissa each fell silent and turned to look in the direction the cry had come, but they saw nothing. "What do you suppose that was?" Jim shrugged. "Probably nothing. Sort of sounded like an elk to me." A ways into the woods, not too far from the burnt remains of the cabin, a creature stirred. A small set of antlers protruded from its scalp, which was covered in long black hair separate from the rest of its body. It stood on 2 legs, with its cloven hooves sunk in the snow. It was slouched over with its disproportionately long arms almost touching the ground as it gazed through the trees towards the 2 people. Most of it was hidden in shadow, except for a glimmer of light which reflected from the crucifix which hung around its neck. The creature had found its prey.